Okay, that should be good. Hey everyone, this video is audio only because I have the lights off. I am doing an experiment to see if I can think more clearly and explain more clearly what I'm thinking so I can get it out when it's dark and I'm just in a relaxed mood, thinking in my most natural flow as opposed to being on a camera. What I'm going to do is akin to what Jordan Peterson does. Essentially, I'm going to think out loud and reason out loud and try to get to the bottom of this. So an issue I have with personality type theory, the function stack and that we have these cognitive functions, right? Something about it strikes me as being overly complicated. And so I'm trying to figure out what I can do, or if there's some truth that I can come to in my mind just by thinking out loud and reasoning. Well, if this is the case and that's the case, let's see. How could these ideas coexist at the same time? What's going on here, right? Which is my most natural mode of thinking, so this should be fun. The main thing I want to try to reason out, I'm trying to reason out the difference between introverted feeling and introverted thinking. Because there just doesn't quite strike me correctly. I'm trying to figure out what that is. I'm trying to figure out how these ideas map onto reality. It's like Carl Jung talked about functions, and then I don't know the details of how the function stack came to be, but it's just a model, okay? I mean, what does it actually mean? That's a more difficult question. I mean, I think there are patterns that exist. Like, for example, the slots do mean something. They represent something. I just don't know exactly what that's referring to. Like first slot NI as opposed to first slot TI is a different thing for sure. It means that it's like they're trying to point out that you have certain patterns in how you think. And the first slot is basically saying that you're really, really focused on this one thing to the point that you tend to neglect the fourth and fifth functions. And so it's saying like I know that the relationships between the slots are a thing. If I'm really, really strong in introverted thinking, that makes TE and FE in opposition to that. They tend to fight each other a little bit. And in the same way, the reason that your blind spot is so weak has to do with the second function being the way that you use the second function. There's a pattern there that pretty much forces the opposite version of that. So if my second function is NE, it pretty much forces my SC to be extremely weak because of the nature of second slot NE, like they're intrinsically tied together. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And that's also important because if my first slot is TI, that would mean that my last slot is FI. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to focus on today is what is the actual distinction? Like, what does that actually mean? Okay, so I'm asking questions to FI users, trying to figure out what they say about their FI, ask questions, the various types, try to figure out how they think and see if I can map out what's going on there. Again, I do believe there are specific patterns, but you have to be aware that psychology is a soft science, and it's very difficult to interpret things in a hard way that is repeatably verifiable, let's say like a scientific experiment. I'm not saying that's necessarily the be-all end-all, but it is something that you can rely on repeatedly, which is something that I value. So first thing I should say is that certain people like to type based on phrases that people use, like, I feel this way about that thing. Oh, I remember this thing that I did and that relates to this way. And you say these things out loud. I think there's some merit in identifying thinking patterns with words. And it's difficult because how do you know the motivation for those words? Like what is the correct way of looking at this? Are the motivations important, or is it just the fact that they said those words? I mean, how do you look at this, right? And that's kind of my issue with theories like the function stack, but that's why we're here. TI versus FI. Introverted thinking is, there are a lot of ways to look at what that is, but on the most fundamental level, it appears to be accuracy or some sort of way of trying to find what is most true, or it's like, so this is where the meat grinds the bones in this talk. is as opposed to FI, which is values. It's like, what do I think is important? Or I guess, what do I feel is important that I think will be effective? In contrast to TI, which is like, what do I think is absolutely true that will lead to others finding it valuable? Not in terms of being effective, but everyone can agree that that's valuable, kind of thing. That's sort of where my mind is at the moment, and figuring these things out. I'm currently lying here listening to music, and I'm just really enjoying it, and I'm just trying to figure out, like, what does it mean for me to be enjoying this music? You may not be able to hear it because the microphone is pretty close to my mouth and the music is pretty far away from the microphone. But it's like, I've noticed that when I start thinking like this, when I'm trying to figure this out, it literally forces my mind off the music, and the enjoyment tends to fade away because of that. That is really interesting. So I think that has something to do with TI versus FI. I'm pretty like, this is my thing. I'm like, is the enjoyment of the music introverted feeling? Is that what that is? Or is that introverted sensing? Or is it something else? Is it like NI even or SC? Like, what is that? What is it? What is it about the music? In a sense, you could argue that music is there's a lot of SI involved in the patterns of music. And in NE, it's like I'm always trying to predict what the music's going to do. That would definitely be an NE thing. So it's like you feel the pattern, you want the pattern to be kind of complex, and you kind of like, whoa, what's going to happen next? It's definitely an NESI thing to do, whereas NISE wouldn't do that. But as for music being TI versus FI, I guess you can listen to it in both ways. So it's not really what the activity is. It's more, how are you engaging that activity? So technically, I could be like a drummer in a band, right? And I could be just focusing on being the most accurate and precise in my drumming, and most consistent, but constantly coming up with new patterns. Be like, ooh, yeah, new pattern here, new pattern there. That would be an INTP and ISTP thing to do. INTPs will tend to repeat patterns that they've played before, whereas ISTPs like to make stuff up on the spot and play tasty licks, as my dad likes to say. Yeah. So there seem to be patterns here, but I'm really trying to figure out, like, what is it that makes FI versus TI? They're like opposing. Why do they oppose? What is that? Just gonna sit here and think. So in my understanding, TI likes to look for the exact relationship between things. It's like precise language, for example. I want to know exactly what every word means so that I can precisely define what I'm saying. I mean, that's kind of what I'm doing right now, right? Whereas FI, I don't really understand what, like, I guess the way I'll think about it is it's trying to figure out what's important. So when I'm parsing out the exact accuracy of all my words, I feel like I'm doing that for the sake of ultimately coming to the truth, because what I think is important is whatever is accurate. And if something is accurate, you can't fight that. You have to resign yourself to that. You have to respect that accuracy. Because if it's literally accurate, then doing something that's inaccurate, when you know what's accurate, you know it's going to result in a worse outcome. So to me, it's like, why would you do something that's inaccurate? And I guess where this leads is, well, what is accuracy? Like, what does it mean for something to be accurate? Is it coherence? No, it's not. It's what is accepted as useful by people. Or it's like, what is it that people value as important? So that's why it's called the TIFE axis. You're trying to find what's accurate for the sake of what others find important. But is that really true? Is it true that whenever I use precise language, is it true that I can do that in a way that everyone agrees, oh yes, that is the correct way we should be doing things. That's the clearest way for everyone to understand. Okay, Meg Myers. She is a musician, okay? And I suspect she is FI hero. She's an INFP, I'm pretty sure. I'm not 100%. She could be ISFP. But in any case, I'm pretty sure she is an FI hero. In the way that, it's like, how do you why does she make music? Or why do I make music? Well, she makes it. She seems to always be trying to understand things. She definitely likes to understand things, but it's a different type of understanding, I think. It's like she's focused on, maybe I should say that the reason I like her music is because to me it inspires a sense of deeper meaning. In fact, both INFJs and INFPs I find are able to do this. Gojira and Meg Myers are able to create this sense of what does it all mean? And it's like but even more so beyond music, movies creates just an ultra deep sense of truth. It's like some of they tell stories in a way that it's sort of like a picture is worth 1,000 words, except it's even more than that. You could say things with visuals and with a story that you can't explain. And in fact, this is kind of where I'm trying to go with all of this. This is what I mean by high production value videos, is producing actual films that can convey these ideas efficiently and effectively so that people just understand it intuitively. And there's no need, you can analyze it and go further, but just the gist of it is like, oh, that's deep. And it just clicks. But why do I like that? Why is it that I'm so attracted to this idea of communicating super deep ideas? I know it's something to do with the world, something about being annoyed that people don't understand things or that I can't communicate clearly. And it's almost like I feel it's my duty to figure this out, to understand how to communicate in a way that people can truly understand amongst all the noise it's not really, the noise isn't necessarily bad, it's just something you have to deal with. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out the difference between like FI valuing things and defining what's important to you, and if ultimately what's going to be effective when applied. That's kind of how they're on the same, they are part of the same thing. It's you're figuring out what's important for the sake of being effective. Whereas TIFE is you're trying to figure out what's accurate and actually true, so that, to me, that it would seem like what's accurate, what's actually true, means that true accuracy, I guess depth is another way to put it, is when you actually apply it, it's effective and it's useful. So I guess what it is TI is taking what people find important and useful. So you're trying to find accuracy in the sense that people find it useful. And then what people find useful is what they can actually apply, something like that. So let's say you have a friend and you see them doing something that you know is going to hurt them, and let's say that you don't have the truth. You don't have an accurate understanding of what's causing that. I guess the question why is another indicator of what TI is doing. It's like, well, if you don't know why they're doing that, you may give them some idea. You're like, well, this could work. But since you weren't accurate, they go take your advice and apply it, and it actually hurts them. And maybe throws them on a bad life path for 5 years. Well, in that sense, your inaccuracy is literally unethical, because when you tried to apply it in the real world, it caused pain, right? On the flip side, FI, like how you decide what to value. Depth is perhaps one way you could think of FI. Depth, values, importance. It's almost like it doesn't make sense to try to understand FI by using TI reasoning. That's kind of the paradox of it. It's like, well, how am I supposed to understand something that by its nature is not compatible with the idea of logical coherency? If that's what FI is, I'm not sure that's what we're trying to figure out. How could someone even be smart enough to recognize that those two things exist? Like what were the thought processes that even led to the formation of the function slots? I get there are a lot of people involved, and each person has little insights, and they click over time, and it becomes this thing. But still, what's going on here? Yeah, let's look at TE. So TE is essentially what's practical. So what's actually going to work? What are conclusions you can take and apply now to get a result? Well, one way I look at that is basically what we're trying to do as humans is get what we want, or what is good for people, or what will you could say lead to rewards in the brain, or probably a better way to put it is what's going to be worthwhile. Like, so example, you do something and you're like, yeah, that was worth it. And I think that, like, oh yeah, that was worth it, is FI or TE or something, one of those two. It's not necessarily what's accurate. I think what's accurate is what allowed you to make it worth it. So you figured out what was TI accurate, okay, and then you applied that, and you're like, oh, it worked. And the accuracy increases the effectiveness, the potency of the TE when you actually apply it, because TE is basically the outcome of TI. So you reason things out like I'm doing right now, and through all that reasoning, you can come to conclusions, and you can use these conclusions. And the more powerful the conclusions are, the more powerful the TE is, and the more valuable people find it. And that's how that works. Like, it's like you come up with an idea, or you figure out a way to have a really accurate understanding of something, and you explain it to an FI user because their TE is looking to see what others think, and they consume that, and then their FI is like, wow, I applied this. This is really valuable. It's because when I applied it was so useful and got me what I wanted. I now value this. Now that's more NI-FI or FI-NI, whereas I guess FI-NA would be more like, I did this and it worked in the past, and because it reliably works every time I do it. This is like also STJ. This is STJ NFP thinking. Since it works every single time I do it, every time I take action and it works, I've come to an accurate. I'm using, if it effectively works, so I'm gonna define it. I think it's valuable because it works every time. But the difference is the FI users, like dominant ones, focus on what's important first, whereas the TE users focus on what's effective first. So the TE users will tend to blast a lot more and just get stuff done, whereas the FI users really want to make sure that it's important before they just go doing a bunch of stuff. And let's just contrast the TI users looking for really what's accurate before they go spouting it off to everyone to make sure that, they're being ethical. That's kind of how that works. And then FE users, this is interesting. I don't really understand this. They're probably the least understood of all for me is FE, how that works exactly. Well, I'd say just sort of like TE, FE is more of a blasting type of function. It kind of blasts out, oh, this is what I think is going to be what people are going to like. This is what people are going to latch on to. And then it's like you're doing that, and you're a little less focused on the accuracy first. So you're really focused on just blasting out, like making sure everything's working well. I'm trying to think of, like, I know that TE is sort of like taking the value of the accuracy, the results of, the better the TI, the stronger the TE can be. So I would say also probably the stronger the FI, the stronger the FE can be. So if people are really good at knowing what's valuable, that means that they can, so it's like for FE users, the more valuable someone knows something is, or feels that something is, the more convicted they are, the more strongly they are resonated with that. And again, both TI and FI can be incorrect, but both the well-developed versions are both really good at what they do, I think. So really good FI allows an FE user like myself to, oh, this is what they want. I clearly see what they want, or not what they want, but like what they think is important. And so I can come up with accuracies that help to solidify that importance. But an FE user will just be like, oh, they think that's important. I'll help them to achieve that. No questions asked. I'll just be affiliative and help everyone achieve what's important. Whereas the TI user is more like, well, let's make sure it's accurate first. I'm going to focus on accuracy first. It's basically like you're dismissive of, maybe not dismissive, but you put whether or not people think things are important on the second shelf. You kind of keep it out of the way on the back burner. It's there, but you strongly prioritize just looking for what's accurate first. ISTPs and INTPs are doing this the most. ENTPs and ESTPs are more balanced about how they do this. They'll consider what other people think are important a lot more than the INTP and ISTP. Whereas the INTP and ISTP are much more balanced in terms of the way that they make those decisions in the first place, let's say, which makes them much smarter, more depth, I should say. Maybe not smart. The extroverted versions are more effective in the world, but it's the cost of being a total accuracy. Same thing with FE users. They're really good at acting out in the world, but at the cost of the depth. So the question is it better to be more of a blast type person, or is it better to be more of a sit back and think and come to a deep conclusion type of person. First answer that comes to mind is probably balance. I think people need to be in balance with each other. Don't have a bunch of INTPs in a room. Get them with some ENTJs, INTJs, ESFPs, ISFPs, and you just get all the right balances of people. You can have sets of groups in a room. They interact with each other. And the question comes down to what should you actually do? TE is like, well, I can effectively apply this, but TI is like, well, wait a minute, is it actually going to be effective though? And TI is basically saving the TE user from doing things that are ineffective. In the same way, FE users are just going with what the FI user decides is important, but what the FI user decides is important depends on what's effective, which it's like this cycle. You need to use TI to feed the TE, which feeds the FI, which feeds the FE. So it's like this cycle. If you figure out what's accurate and you teach it to a TE user, they'll figure out what's important based on that. And then you could be like, oh, they think that's important. Let me figure out how to achieve that importance. Then it's like this cycle of continuously refining these things. My question is, though, is there a way that these things relate to each other that's not so straightforward and is actually not true, perhaps? Yeah, it's really good at realizing. Kind of a pet peeve I have is when I know something's true and I can't get people to listen because they're looking at what everyone else is saying. TE looks at social proof more than TI. So the TE users are going by what everyone says because like, well, it must be the most effective if the most people say so, or if it's like the most thought of idea, or I don't know, something like that. And so I see people doing all these things that aren't useful. It's actually to make them less happy, but since their brains can't see that, but mine can. If people aren't really aware of TI like ENFPs, they're kind of aloof to all of the deep thinking that was done to come to the conclusions you made. And in the same way, SE, I'm SE a trickster, so I'm kind of aloof to the information people are using in the first place to reason. I kind of ignore new information. I just reason based on what I've already gathered or what I already know. That's kind of an issue.